This is 8-Minute Climate Fix, a podcast helping you understand the energy and climate challenge in just a few minutes. I'm your host, Paul Schuster. The relationship we have with nature is broken, and it's going to take a lot to get ourselves back on track. In today's conversation, I speak with Tim Christophersen, VP of Climate Action at Salesforce, and previously the head of Nature for Climate branch at the United Nations Environment Program. Tim has recently written an excellent book entitled Generation Restoration: How to Fix Our Relationship Crisis with Mother Nature, that digs deep into how we got here in the first place and what we need to do to repair this broken bond. 8 minutes. It's how long it takes the sun's rays to hit Earth, or about half the time that it took Bad Bunny to transform the Super Bowl into a Latin-inspired dance party. We just won't discuss what happened to my Patriots. All right, let's get it on. Tim Christophersen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Paul. Looking forward.
Tim, excited to have you here. Really enjoyed reading your book, Generation Restoration. I thought that this was a fantastic book and in many ways a very needed book in today's climate in terms of really understanding our relationship with Mother Nature, the different challenges that we have to repair that relationship. But before we get into all of that, let's start with who Tim Christophersen is, your background and what brought you to this point of writing this book in the first place.
Sure. So as you said, I'm working for a big technology company right now. I'm leading Salesforce Climate Action. But if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would not have thought that a likely job because I'm a forester by background. I'm not a technologist necessarily. And I come from a very rural area in northern Germany. When I grew up, there wasn't really that much else to do, but spent a lot of time in nature, hiking, camping, fishing. So I love nature. I think it dates back to that growing up. And what inspired me to write the book is I think that I feel that the collective relationship we have with nature is broken. And it is the basis of many of the symptoms we see of what some call like the UN Environment Program, the triple planetary crisis of climate change, nature loss, and pollution. If you look at the underlying cause, there is something wrong in our philosophical and relational understanding of nature and our role in it.
Yeah, it really is one of those things that it's taken us generations to break this bond with Mother Nature. And we have a very short amount of time to fix that and reinvest into building a more nurturing and positive relationship. Tim, you mentioned growing up in Germany and developing this love of nature from an early age. In the book, you actually mentioned that you and your family spent 10 years in Kenya as well. And I was interested in terms of how that had influenced your own relationship with nature.
Kenya is a beautiful country. I really highly recommend to anybody who loves nature and also those who want to rediscover their relationship with nature to visit Kenya. The UN Environment Program's headquarters is in Nairobi. So when I worked for UNEP for altogether 15 years, we were first in Montreal, where I worked for the Convention on Biodiversity, and then moved to Nairobi with my family. And I think for our family, what struck us when we saw these breathtaking views, amazing wildlife on safari, is the immense wealth of wildlife you still have, but you also see that this is just a fragment of what used to be the natural heritage of Africa, and you can translate that into other parts of the world, to Europe, to North America, to Asia. Wherever you look, you find out we live in a sort of 10% world. We live in a world that is 10% of what the natural wealth we used to have, or you could say are entitled to, and that nature is entitled to. We have whittled that down to 10%. It's not a precise statistic. From some perspectives, like the species that have gone extinct, we live in a 0% world, but we still have 50% of the forest resources the planet used to have a few hundred years ago. But I think the key lesson is how to work with nature to bring back that wealth and abundance that would enable all of us, humans and nature, to live not only in harmony, but live a good life that has all the economic, social, and spiritual requirements for a fulfilling life for humanity. And I think we can get there. This is one of the key messages of the book.
It is. It actually resonates throughout the entirety of the book. This shift in philosophy that needs to occur with respect to our relationship with nature. Um, and it's not a very easy shift to make. You know, our Western worldview, if you will, is really measured and structured and guided almost to think about nature as an afterthought, something that we draw upon, but we don't necessarily need to replenish per se. And you talk within the book about how that Western philosophy, that Western worldview really needs an update, really needs to be changed in terms of how we view nature and the natural resources around us. Tell me more about that. Tell me about, what that conceit is and how you approach that within the book.
So the subtitle of the book is How to Fix Our Relationship Crisis with Mother Nature. And I mean that quite literal. If we were in a human relationship with nature, we would be headed for a divorce or a breakup of the family because the relationship we're in is abusive. And we all know of relationships like that. Maybe we've been in one of an abusive relationship where one side always takes all the time, all the attention, all the money, all the it's a take, take, take. You never give back. A relationship that is not reciprocal is toxic and it has to end. They always end one way or another. Our relationship with nature cannot end because it would mean our end. It wouldn't mean the end of nature. But we cannot let that happen. So we have to make sure we not only make peace with nature, but go a step further, repair a lot of the damage that we have inflicted. Now, to your point, why is that so difficult? You would think, well, that's a piece of cake. We just sort of treat nature better. But why that is so difficult is when you go back to about 300, 350 years back in time and you look at the era of enlightenment, which was, by the way, named by the philosophers themselves, who were the predominant philosophers of the era of enlightenment, because what they brought is, of course, a lot of progress on policymaking and societal understanding. But it was also a time when this separation from nature was cemented in our philosophical worldview of the Western world. René Descartes, in particular, was adamant that only humans were divinely inspired beings. So it's only us who have sort of the divine spark. Everything else is a machine. Is an intricate mechanism put here for us to either eat or liquefy or burn or whatever else we do with nature if we see nature as a commodity. And of course, since then, we have a much better understanding of how animals think and feel, what relationships they can build, what interactions exist in nature, and that competition is not the predominant guiding and organizing principle of nature. As Darwin in his early life, and there's one sentence we all know from Darwin is this principle of the survival of the fittest. But later in life, he actually nuanced that a lot and said that there is a lot more competition, is a lot more collaboration in nature than there is competition, both within species, between species, and within entire ecosystems. So we have to adjust two mental concepts at the same time that are deeply ingrained in our Western worldview. One is that every species that is not human is a sort of second-class citizen or a thing, a commodity. And everything that structures human society is mirrored on this principle that it is all about competition, whereas in nature it is actually mostly about collaboration. So it's a double whammy of adjustment. But if we adjust our mindset and our understanding, we are capable of a healthy, productive, reciprocal relationship with nature that can allow us a life in abundance and diversity.
It's interesting because I don't think I've ever really thought about our relationship with nature as being one of in competition. If anything, I think it's more parasitic
Yeah,
in terms of us
yeah.
taking from that relationship and not necessarily replenishing on our own. But I think your core argument does hold true. The need to build a collaborative relationship, the need to lift everything up and jointly succeed.
It does. I think the competition angle that impacts nature is not so much that we see ourselves in competition with nature, even though that is also true in some aspects, but more that we're in this constant race of competition with each other, with your peers, with your colleagues, between nations, between companies. And again, some of that is useful and necessary, but some of it is putting us under things like the tragedy of the commons. Because if you don't take that natural resource that's over there, or that fish that is in the high seas, somebody else will. And then somebody else will be richer and have more. And that idea of competition for resources is so deeply ingrained in our Western thinking that we have collectively, of course, managed nature down to this 10% world. And if you think about the words economy and ecology, is an interesting aspect there that they have the same root, right? They come from oikos, our common home. This is our common home or our common household in ancient Greek. And the economy is the management of that household, and ecology is the knowledge of that household. What we're doing right now is we're managing this entire household Earth without really knowing how it works or even what the budget is that we have and how to replenish it instead of just taking from our natural capital bank account. So a deeper understanding of ecology and ecological literacy is fundamental for running the economy in a better way, because right now it's collectively running us aground. And you can see that happening when we now come to the planetary boundaries, such as climate change, such as nature loss, but also the global nitrogen cycle and pollution. We are starting to crash into these planetary boundaries because our economy lacks fundamental ecological literacy.
So it sounds like it's kind of a two-step process to repair this relationship. On the first hand, you use the analogy of a budget, of like a household budget, if I will, and to gain financial literacy, you need first to understand what you're spending money on and what those investments are, and frankly, um, don't overspend. Make certain that you stay within your means and stay within that budget, and then you can start to take the steps around reinvesting and refurbishing and replenishing into the natural environment. So it's kind of that two-step process. But both of those are really big challenges. I mean, in some instances, on that second point, there are research studies indicating that it's going to take $1 trillion a year in order to repair our natural infrastructure. And you can't do that individually. Any one of us, or even large companies, you can't do that even as a Salesforce, regardless of how big Salesforce is. It's going to take much more of a concerted effort, and that needs to be led by the public sector. And really, this concerted motion on the part of governments to affect natural capital and the natural infrastructure. Tim, what are your thoughts around what's needed to push the public sector into this direction? Both in terms of first not overspending our natural resources, but then setting us up for that reinvestment, that replenishment into natural infrastructure.
Yeah, let's talk about the worlds of finance and nature for a while and how they're starting to merge. This is actually a fascinating story over the last 20 years or so. And in summary, there's now a much better understanding of what we call natural capital than there ever was, because until recently, and it was only last decade that the UN started to measure in the Handbook of National Statistics. If you ever want to read like a 1,000-page book that is super boring.
Sounds amazing.
It sounds amazing, but it's a very important book because that guides what governments measure to tell you if your country is doing well or not. They measure things like longevity and literacy. And in that, for the first time, is now included natural capital. How much clean air, how much fish, how much forest do you have, how much clean water do you have? Because what you can do as a nation when you just want to increase GDP, you can burn all those things and sell them and cut them down, and it boosts your GDP for a short time, but it draws down your natural capital, also draws down your social capital because your population will become more unhealthy. So that integration of natural capital in key government decision-making is essential, and that's starting to happen now. At the same time, in the last 30 odd years, we have lost about 40% of all natural capital globally, which is astonishing. This is per capita, which of course also means the world population has grown. So for each of us, there's 40% less natural capital than there was in the early 1990s. So let's take those two things together and see if you're a government decision maker and you have made the decision to invest $1 trillion in infrastructure like Germany has just announced, then nature absolutely is part of that critical infrastructure because it underpins what people drink, if they have clean drinking water or not. It underpins if you have mudslides that wash away entire villages or cities. It underpins how much natural resources you have to grow your food, if your soil biodiversity is intact, if your soil is healthy, how much erosion you have. So all of those things that we have taken for granted, all of natural capital, is now starting to be measured and taken into account. So I think that nature is our most essential infrastructure and that we need to set aside sufficient public works budgets and new public-private partnership, like the one that we'll see launched this week in Davos called the Forest Future Alliance. It will happen because it's an inevitable conclusion of thinking through that broader understanding of what the wealth of nation really means. It means a holistic concept of your social capital, your natural capital, your financial capital, all seen together, and that is starting to happen. I'm quite, despite current first page headlines, I'm quite optimistic that there is a much broader understanding about these things than there was just a few years ago.
Yeah, to paraphrase, the long arc of history bends towards progress. Tim, you mentioned the public-private partnerships, and in particular, the Future Forest Alliance. And for those in the audience, we're actually recording this episode during the week of Davos. I think it actually kicked off maybe about 2 days ago or so, even though this particular episode isn't going to probably be published for another few weeks, just to give a sense about the global conversations that are occurring at the highest levels right now. And that public-private conversation is starting to happen. But what about private companies in and of themselves? What's the role of the private company as they think about this replenishment and reinforcement of our relationship with nature?
So I've spent most of my career in public service for the United Nations and for the European Commission. And when Salesforce approached me about 4 years ago to join them, I had to really think long and hard about the private sector and why to join them. But what I found out when I researched more deeply into what Salesforce is, and I read Mark Benioff's book, which is called Trailblazers, so Chairman and CEO, is that because we are connected to all the Fortune 500 companies, more or less 200,000 companies and institutional customers, including 60,000 NGOs, who trust us with their data management, there is a deep trust relation between Salesforce and those companies. So that vantage point of being able to collaborate and coalesce around certain goals, form coalitions and alliances to collectively move the needle and trigger systemic change. That is a fascinating opportunity that exists in the private sector to a degree of speed and scale, which is not easily found in the public sector. Ideally, though, we would combine that speed and scale and the entrepreneurial vision and the sheer financial muscle of the private sector with key public sector initiatives and actors into public-private partnerships. And one of the ones that you just referred to that is now being upgraded is called the Trillion Trees Initiative, or 1T.org, which we started 5 years ago with Salesforce, and which is, I think, the main reason they brought me on board 4 years ago to help run it.
They reached out to the forestry guy.
They actually kept calling me anyway, because I'd advised them from the UN side to set this up as part of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and then Salesforce kept calling me and asking, so now what do we do, and who do you work with? How do you do this? Who else do we engage? And at some point, they just asked me to join and set up a nature team and a water team, and in the meantime, I'm also responsible for the carbon credits and energy portfolio at Salesforce. But that's how I landed there. But the Trillion Trees Initiative was set up as a public-private partnership because also the US, also China, Canada, other countries have pledged to restore forests. What is happening now is that this is broadening into a public-private partnerships also with financial institutions, with companies that have large nature assets already under management, with a lot of these new nature investment funds that we see emerging at a pretty rapid pace, and some of which have reached the $1 billion+ mark. So there's a lot of momentum going on. I think the World Economic Forum can really play an important role in helping to guide these partnerships in the right direction, such as in Brazil, where we now see really nature restoration taking off as a large-scale industry that is reaching unprecedented levels of investments in nature.
So you mentioned Brazil, and certainly the Conference of Parties here in 2025 was held down in Belém in the Amazonian rainforest. And Tim, I believe you actually had a chance to attend the COP this year. And certainly a big part of the conversations at the COP this year were around the activities that Brazil were taking, driven in part by the indigenous population and the voice of the indigenous peoples as they've really taken a leadership role in terms of this replenishment of nature. Tim, you used a couple of examples in your book, maybe not of Brazil directly, but of this this relationship that indigenous peoples have had with nature over time, and some of the lessons that we within our Western philosophy and our Western worldview could take from that leadership. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, indeed. Of course, that new relationship with nature is not new to indigenous peoples. They would probably say, oh, well, finally they're getting it. And I think one of the most inspiring examples of a large-scale indigenous-led not only nature conservation, but restoration initiative that I know of and that we've had the privilege to support at Salesforce, and is called Acción Andina. That only started about 6 years ago in the high Andes. So we're talking about sort of above 4,000 meters or 12, 13,000 feet altitude from Venezuela to Patagonia. The high Andes used to have cloud forests. There used to be forests that were almost perpetually in the clouds, capturing moisture, storing it in wetlands in the soil in high altitudes, and then it sort of would trickle down from there. There's only about 10% of those high altitude forests left, which means today, as the glaciers are retreating, as the other main source of fresh water, it is essential for most of the continent that we restore these large-scale water towers on top of the continent. And Acción Andina is now mobilized over 30,000 people, mostly volunteers. They're planting indigenous trees in over 400 locations. It's now spanning 5 countries. And the principle why so many people engage is the reciprocity with the ecosystem. These are high mountain, high altitude communities who live under harsh conditions, often are very poor, but they do understand that reciprocity with the mountain, with the ecosystem, with nature, and that you have to give back. So what we see is, even though this should be a major public works infrastructure spending for most of Latin American countries, Lima, for example, gets most of its drinking water from those high Andes watersheds. Instead, it is the most vulnerable frontline communities who are taking the leadership. So I think we have to all support those kinds of efforts. And we have to all support the kinds of indigenous leadership and stewardship we see for the conservation of the Amazon basin, for restoration of nature in areas that have been degraded, and for the restoration of this understanding of a reciprocal relationship with nature.
So, not only a public private partnership, but also partnering with some of these cultures who have already developed that relationship and can help guide us down that path as well.
This is where definitely we have to look and learn and partner with the right stakeholders as well. And what I learned at COP30 in Belém when I was there in the Amazon for the climate conference is that indigenous peoples are more than willing and highly competent to be engaged in what Brazil now calls the socio-bioeconomy. So the bioeconomy as in biodiversity is the basis for economic activity, and with a sufficient basis, you can generate not only a lot of economic return, but also that return of natural capital and healthy social capital. So that bioeconomy that Brazil is pushing in the G20 and worldwide is, I hope, what will be a vessel for that nature restoration idea to even reach larger proportions, get more people involved, because this is no longer sort of fringe topic or a luxury idea that you would invest in nature restoration. We've overdrawn our natural capital bank account as humanity. And when you've overdrawn your bank account at some point, there's some real consequences. And we're starting to see those consequences now. So it's time that we replenish, get back to a sound natural capital, but also more importantly, a sound relationship with nature that is not based on extraction, but is based on regeneration.
So, with that, what guidance would you provide to the public sector about the next steps that we should take around policies and regulations and investments, and the things that the public sector should discreetly do to repair this relationship with nature?
Yeah, I just wrote an agenda blog for that for the WNEP. Maybe we can share it together with your podcast. I'll send it to you. Because look, we need to look to Brazil. Brazil is experimenting exactly with that question. And they have made large public subsidies available that they are starting to shift away from extractive activities to restoration. For example, they're starting to give out large public land concessions of degraded land for restoration concessions. That gives a lot of planning security for these new companies like Regreen or Mombak that are making it their business to invest in nature restoration. They've developed and are implementing a carbon law that gives more planning security. They are supporting mapping what the bioeconomy assets are, for example, in the Amazon with new technologies like LiDAR and other highly detailed mapping of forests.
We're actually doing some of that here at Entity Data as well. We have something called a smart rainforest where we can use satellite imagery and drones, bioacoustics, internet connected devices to monitor not just the health of the forest, but the biodiversity of the ecosystem as well. And to hear of a country and of a public sector taking that step forward and really monitoring and investing back into something like that. That, to your point, that can be very, very powerful.
Yeah, I've been very impressed with NTT and especially the high amount of investments in R&D in this space. So, yeah, if you can,
a little bit of a marketing hat on right there, but it's
if we can lend our strengths as companies to those kinds of developments, that will certainly be very useful. And then from Brazil, this has to go to other regions. The EU adopted a bioeconomy strategy last year. They also have what is called the EU Nature Restoration Law. So by the year 2030, which is sort of around the corner, EU countries must restore 20% at least of their degraded landscapes and seascapes, and then go to full restoration by 2050. So that shift from this understanding that nature investments is the realm of NGOs and small-scale philanthropy to large-scale public works projects and shifting supply chains and large-scale private sector investments, that will happen in other regions as well. I think with the right technology, we can help to accelerate that trend.
That's a massive program on the part of the EU to try to replenish and refurbish that forestry. That's fantastic.
It is fantastic, though we have to say that this landed in the ministries of environment, which are often not the best placed in terms of handling large budgets or even having the political clout to make things happen. I think
picturing a dark closet in the basement of a British parliamentary building or something.
That's right. And of course, they deserve more resources and clout, but they often don't have it. I think we should also move this to where industrial policy is made, to ministries of economics, to ministries of finance. So that understanding that nature is something to be dealt with by a small department within the smallest ministry in a government, which tends to be the Ministry of Environment, is also something we need to revisit. And some countries have pulled this sort of out of obscurity into mainstream government policy. This is again where we can learn from Brazil with the National Bioeconomy Secretariat. The bioeconomy is the domain of the Minister of Economics. And I think that kind of shift to a more powerful government oversight and investment opportunity it will also happen hopefully in Europe and elsewhere.
So again, a fantastic book, really dives deep into this broken relationship that we've created with Mother Nature, discusses some of the different things that we need to do as a society to both stabilize and then reinvest and grow that collaborative, mutually beneficial relationship. But it's honest as well in its perspective, recognizing that there's a lot that needs to get done. Tim, are you optimistic about our future, about the things that we need to do in order to repair this relationship?
So first of all, I believe that life is much less about results than we believe and much more about making the right choices and what integrity we have. So I think at the end of the day, what matters is the decisions that we take, not the end result. But I am also optimistic about the result because optimism in itself is not something that happens to you from the outside. It is not an external thing. Optimism is a mindset. And cultivating that mindset is very important for doing the things we need to do, like restoring nature at a planetary scale. And I like Paul Romer as an economist. I like his little story about these two kinds of optimism. One is the unconditional optimism, where you basically like a child waiting for presents, which is not very useful in the current state of the world. The other is conditional optimism. That's more like a child who wants to build a tree house and goes around to gather everybody in the neighborhood and parents and the family and with the enthusiasm to collect the right tools and get a few things together. And if we all pull together, we can build something really cool. So that treehouse has got to be there because it's conditional optimism. You just believe that this will happen because you want it to happen. And in this case, nature restoration and rebuilding a relationship, it also needs to happen. So that's why I'm optimistic. But we all need to be conditional optimists. We cannot afford pessimism. This is just an energy drain. We need to plug that. Optimism is mandatory in this line of work.
Conditional optimism. I like it. Tim Christophersen, Vice President of Climate at Salesforce. The book is Generation Restoration, How to Fix Our Relationship Crisis with Mother Nature. Highly recommend that everyone listening to this podcast go out onto Amazon today and purchase your copy. Fantastic, fantastic read. Tim, thank you for joining us here on 8 Minute Climate Fix.
It was a pleasure. Thanks, Paul.